Inside this fortress, roughly 100,000 Japanese troops were waiting. For years, they dug miles of subterranean tunnels, fortified the beaches, and braced for an apocalyptic American invasion. But the invasion never came. In August 1945, when the Japanese Empire finally surrendered, that colossal, fully equipped garrison was still sitting exactly where it started, completely intact. The Americans had defeated them long before the surrender, simply by making sure they no longer mattered. How do you destroy a 100,000-man fortress without ever actually fighting it? The fortress in question was Rabaul, situated on the northeastern tip of New Britain in the Bismarck archipelago. By mid-1943, it had grown into the terrifying, beating heart of Imperial Japanese power in the South Pacific. From the sheltered, deep-water anchorages of Simpson Harbor and a network of 5 sprawling airfields, the Japanese military projected overwhelming naval and aviation superiority across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. It was the central staging ground, the vital logistical hub that fueled the strikes bleeding Allied forces dry during the early, desperate phases of the Pacific War. For the Allied commanders tasked with pushing the offensive northward, Rabaul presented a paralyzing strategic nightmare. The traditional military doctrine of the era dictated a brutal, straightforward logic. A stronghold of that immense scale, positioned directly on an advancing flank, absolutely had to be eliminated. But when intelligence officers reviewed the aerial reconnaissance photographs, they saw an impenetrable death trap. Rabaul was naturally shielded by active volcanoes and steep, unforgiving ridges. It bristled with hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft batteries, coastal artillery emplacements, and a deeply entrenched garrison holding a stockpile of ammunition meant to sustain years of continuous combat. A frontal amphibious assault would demand an unthinkable toll in human lives. The projected casualty estimates for a direct invasion were categorically unacceptable, a guaranteed bloodbath that threatened to permanently derail the entire Pacific timetable. Yet, the alternative seemed equally impossible. Leaving a fully operational naval and air hub untouched in their rear meant exposing vulnerable Allied supply lines and troop transports to constant, devastating strikes. Rabaul was essentially a loaded gun pointed directly at the Allied advance. Planners were trapped in a seemingly unsolvable dilemma. They could not storm the beaches without sacrificing a staggering number of men, and they could not simply bypass it without risking total operational collapse from behind. The situation demanded a radical shift in how the Allies thought about military conquest. If capturing the fortress meant unacceptable losses and leaving it active meant certain disaster, they had to invent an entirely new approach to siege warfare. How exactly did the United States military manage to completely neutralize one of the most heavily defended, formidable bases on the planet without ever attempting to capture it? To understand exactly how paralyzing this bottleneck was, you have to rewind the clock to January 1942. The Japanese war machine was expanding across the Pacific with terrifying, unchecked speed, sweeping through Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. But to secure their newly conquered empire, to build a defensive perimeter that would keep the Allies entirely out of the Western Pacific, they needed a southern anchor. They found it on the northeastern tip of the island of New Britain. If you trace a line on a map of the Southwest Pacific, New Britain sits right at the critical intersection of the region's major sea lanes, acting as a massive geographical shield over the deep water approaches to the Philippines and the Japanese home islands. At the very northern edge of this shield, resting on the Gazelle Peninsula, lies Rabaul. Nature had constructed a military architect's absolute dream. Simpson Harbor, the body of water defining the area, is actually a sunken volcanic caldera. This created a naturally protected, incredibly deep water basin. It was massive enough to securely anchor an entire armada, from the heaviest battleships and fleet aircraft carriers down to dozens of vital logistical supply ships. All of these vessels could sit inside the harbor, completely shielded from unpredictable ocean swells and largely protected from early submarine torpedo attacks by the narrow, easily mined entrance channels. The surrounding terrain was equally perfect for defense. The harbor was ringed by a horseshoe of active and dormant volcanoes. The volcanic ash soil was soft enough to be easily excavated by hand and light machinery, yet structurally sound enough to prevent cave-ins. This allowed Japanese combat engineers to immediately begin carving out a subterranean city, digging miles of underground facilities, ammunition dumps, hospitals, and command posts safe from aerial observation. Furthermore, the flatlands surrounding the harbor were perfectly suited for aviation. Engineers quickly laid down not just one, but 5 interlocking airfields, including the massive Lakunai and Vunakanau strips. The Japanese military recognized instantly that this was not merely a tactical outpost. It was the absolute geographical linchpin of the Southern Pacific. Whoever controlled Rabaul controlled the airspace and sea lanes over the dense jungles of New Guinea to the west, and the long, sweeping chain of the Solomon Islands stretching away to the southeast. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, the Japanese Imperial High Command did not just occupy the town. They effectively militarized the entire topography. They poured in construction battalions, naval infantry, elite aviation squadrons, and tens of thousands of regular army troops. They built deep water piers, massive repair docks capable of fixing damaged cruisers, and heavy industrial workshops to maintain the endless streams of Zero fighters and Betty bombers passing through. Rabaul was rapidly transformed into a sprawling, heavily industrialized military metropolis. It became the central nervous system for every single Japanese offensive striking southward toward Australia. When Japanese forces pushed over the grueling Kokoda Track in New Guinea, they were fed, armed, and reinforced by barges and transport ships sailing directly out of Rabaul. When the Imperial Japanese Navy engaged American fleets in the brutal nighttime surface battles around Guadalcanal, their heavy cruisers and destroyers sailed from the anchorages of Simpson Harbor. By holding this single, heavily fortified geographical knot, Japan forced the United States and its allies into a devastating funnel. General Douglas MacArthur, pushing his armies up through the suffocating jungles of New Guinea, and Admiral William Halsey, fighting his way island by island up the Solomon chain, were moving along 2 separate axes of advance. But both of those axes pointed directly at one terrifying convergence point. Rabaul was the unavoidable lock on the door to the Central Pacific, and the keys were held by a garrison that was rapidly swelling toward 100,000 men. In the strategic war rooms in Washington, Pearl Harbor, and Brisbane, there was initially no debate about what had to be done. The rigid military doctrine of the 1940s, taught in every war college from Leavenworth to Annapolis, offered very little flexibility when dealing with a fortress of this magnitude. World War II was, at its core, viewed through the lens of Clausewitzian annihilation. You sought out the enemy's main strength, you applied overwhelming physical force, and you ground it into dust through decisive battle. The prevailing wisdom dictated that you absolutely could not advance your main forces past a massive, heavily fortified enemy stronghold. If you bypassed a base harboring 100,000 troops, hundreds of strike aircraft, and a fleet of warships, you were willingly handing the enemy a dagger to plunge into your back. The moment your invasion fleets and supply convoys moved past the fortress, the enemy bombers would launch from those untouched airfields, while their cruisers and submarines would slip out of the harbor. They would sever your fragile logistical umbilical cords. They would sink your slow-moving troop transports, cut your fuel supply lines, and starve your advancing armies in the field. In traditional military theory, a massive fortress on the flank was an existential threat that had to be physically neutralized through direct, bloody conquest. Therefore, the initial Allied blueprints for the South Pacific assumed that a catastrophic, full-scale amphibious assault on Rabaul was an unavoidable destiny. It was penciled in as the grim, inevitable climax of the entire regional campaign. But when the planning staffs actually began to crunch the logistical and tactical mathematics of a frontal assault on the Gazelle Peninsula, the numbers they generated were chilling. Standard amphibious doctrine required an attacking force to outnumber a fortified defender by a minimum ratio of 3 to 1, just to secure a functional beachhead against entrenched opposition. With intelligence accurately estimating that the Rabaul garrison was approaching the 100,000 mark, the Allies would need an invasion force of roughly 300,000 men. In 1943, generating a 300,000-man amphibious invasion force in the South Pacific was practically impossible. The sheer volume of transport shipping required to move that many troops, alongside their artillery, Sherman tanks, aviation fuel, and millions of tons of combat rations, simply did not exist. The Allied merchant marine and naval transport fleets were already stretched to the absolute breaking point, simultaneously supplying the war effort in the Atlantic, the strategic bombing campaigns in Europe, and the ground wars in the Soviet Union and North Africa. Even if the shipping could somehow be conjured out of thin air, the tactical reality of the assault itself presented a nightmare scenario. Planners envisioned the initial waves of Marines and infantry approaching the narrow mouths of Simpson Harbor in flat-bottomed Higgins boats. They would have to navigate densely packed naval minefields and jagged coral reefs, all while under the plunging, registered fire of hundreds of heavy coastal defense guns. The Japanese had positioned these artillery batteries perfectly along the elevated volcanic ridges, giving them clear lines of sight over every conceivable approach vector. Every potential landing beach was a mathematically calculated, pre-sighted kill zone. Every surrounding ridge was being hollowed out and filled with interlocking machine gun nests and anti-tank ditches. The Japanese infantry had already proven on much smaller island outposts that they would not surrender, choosing instead to fight to the last man from deep subterranean bunkers that naval bombardment and aerial bombing could barely scratch. Rabaul was not just a base, it was an intricately designed killing floor. To take Rabaul by force meant ordering tens of thousands of American and Australian troops directly into a geographic meat grinder. The casualty estimates were not just sobering, they were strategically paralyzing. Planners realized a direct assault could easily cost the Allies upwards of 50,000 casualties. It would chew through entire veteran divisions, decimate the vital landing craft inventory, and exhaust the supply depots of the entire theater. Even in the unlikely event of a total, rapid victory, the sheer physical and logistical exhaustion of taking the fortress would stall the entire Pacific offensive for 6 months to a year. Taking that pause to rebuild would grant the Japanese Empire exactly what it needed most: vital time to fortify its inner defensive rings closer to the home islands and drag the war out indefinitely. The Allied High Command was locked in a devastating strategic paradox. The rigid rules of war demanded that Rabaul be destroyed. The terrifying mathematics of reality dictated that Rabaul could not be assaulted. To proceed with the invasion was to risk bleeding the Pacific Fleet dry in a single, localized bloodbath. But to stall the advance, halting the entire theater momentum just to stare at the fortress from a safe distance, was exactly what the Japanese High Command wanted. It would turn the South Pacific into a grinding, static war of attrition, playing perfectly into Japan's overarching strategy of making the conflict simply too costly in American lives for the public to stomach. The situation required a total deconstruction of how armies fought and how victories were measured. The fundamental assumption of centuries of warfare was that an enemy army's strength resided in its weapons, its layered fortifications, and the sheer number of its soldiers holding the line. But a handful of Allied planners began to look at the map differently. They started to realize that a fortress, no matter how heavily armored, is essentially a living organism. And a living organism does not necessarily need to be crushed by blunt force. If you understand its anatomy, you can simply cut off its oxygen. To cut off that oxygen, the top brass of the Allied Pacific Command had to throw centuries of established military doctrine out the window. During the tense spring and summer of 1943, a profound strategic consensus began to form between the two men responsible for driving the Japanese Empire back: General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, and Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area. Despite their often clashing egos and fierce competition for resources, they looked at the terrifying intelligence reports from Rabaul and reached the exact same, highly unorthodox conclusion. They were not going to storm the beaches of the Gazelle Peninsula. They were not going to send hundreds of thousands of Allied troops into the teeth of Japanese coastal artillery. Instead, they formalized a radical, overarching strategy that would become known as Operation Cartwheel. It was an audacious blueprint that proposed doing the one thing military academies explicitly warned against. They were going to deliberately leave the enemy's absolute strongest point completely intact and simply walk right past it. Operation Cartwheel was not a single massive battle, but a synchronized, multi-pronged offensive designed to weave a net around the Bismarck archipelago. MacArthur's ground forces would push steadily along the northern coast of New Guinea, leapfrogging from one humid jungle outpost to the next. Simultaneously, Halsey's amphibious forces would climb the ladder of the Solomon Islands from the southeast. But here was the brilliant, defining twist of the entire operation. Instead of aiming their spearheads directly at Rabaul, MacArthur and Halsey would target the lightly defended, seemingly insignificant islands on Rabaul's extreme outer perimeter. They were looking for flat geography. They wanted islands like Bougainville or New Georgia, places where the Japanese garrison was relatively small, but the terrain was naturally suited for rapid airfield construction. The strategy was to capture a patch of jungle, instantly bring in the Navy Seabees and Army combat engineers with their bulldozers, and carve out a heavy bomber strip before the Japanese could mount a serious counterattack. By establishing these forward air bases, the Allies would inch their fighter cover and bomber squadrons ever closer to Simpson Harbor. They would systematically capture the islands around Rabaul, effectively building a cage of Allied air and naval power. But on paper, this strategy represented a colossal, terrifying gamble. The Allied High Command was actively choosing to leave a highly motivated, heavily armed force of roughly 100,000 Imperial Japanese troops operating directly in their rear echelons. It was a calculated risk of unprecedented proportions. If the Japanese commanders at Rabaul realized what was happening and decided to launch a massive, coordinated counteroffensive using their formidable naval assets and bomber fleets, they could easily sever the fragile Allied supply lines stretching back to Australia and Pearl Harbor. MacArthur and Halsey were betting the entire Pacific timeline on the belief that air power and naval interdiction could effectively neutralize a ground army without having to physically fight it. They were betting they could starve the fortress faster than the fortress could strike back. The directive fundamentally changed the nature of the war in the Pacific. It shifted the objective from bloody conquest to methodical strangulation. There would be no D-Day at Rabaul. The 100,000 Japanese troops digging tunnels and zeroing their artillery on the beaches were preparing for a grand, apocalyptic battle that the Americans had already quietly canceled. Instead, the Allies were going to turn the vast ocean around Rabaul into an impassable desert. They would hunt down the supply ships, shoot down the reinforcing aircraft, and sever the communication lines, turning the impenetrable fortress into a massive, self-sustaining prison camp. But drawing a noose on a tactical map in a safe headquarters was easy. Actually tightening that noose meant flying directly into the teeth of Japanese air power, taking on seasoned Zero pilots, and braving skies thick with anti-aircraft fire. The order was given, the invasion was called off, and Operation Cartwheel was officially set into motion. Now, the Allies just had to prove that their theoretical cage of air power could actually hold a monster. To dismantle an impregnable fortress without a ground assault, the Allied Pacific Command first had to blind it. The theoretical cage envisioned by MacArthur and Halsey required raw, unrelenting kinetic application, and that meant systematically stripping away Rabaul's absolute mastery of the sky. In late 1943, this monumental task fell primarily to General George Kenney and his 5th Air Force, operating out of newly carved jungle airstrips in New Guinea. Kenny understood that high-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine preferred in the European theater, was largely ineffective against the sprawling, camouflaged infrastructure of a tropical stronghold. The dense jungle canopy swallowed bombs, and the Japanese combat engineers at Rabaul were notoriously efficient, capable of filling runway craters and repairing facilities overnight. To break the back of the Japanese aviation shield, Kenny ordered a brutal, low-level war of attrition. The primary instruments of this assault were heavily modified B-25 Mitchell bombers. Kenny's mechanics had stripped the glass noses off these medium bombers and packed them with 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, transforming them into devastating low-altitude strafers. Beginning in October 1943, these squadrons roared over the volcanic ridges of the Gazelle Peninsula at treetop height. They did not just target the runways of Lakunai and Vunakanau. They hunted the aircraft revetments, the fuel dumps, and the anti-aircraft emplacements, dropping parachute-retarded fragmentation bombs that shredded aluminum fuselages and obliterated maintenance crews. For the Japanese defenders, the initial reaction to this aerial siege was a supreme, almost arrogant confidence. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding the naval aviation forces at Rabaul, commanded hundreds of elite A-6M0 fighters and veteran pilots who had combat experience dating back to the invasion of China. When the early Allied raids approached, the sirens wailed across Simpson Harbor, and dozens of Zeros scrambled into the humid sky, intercepting the American formations with lethal efficiency. The anti-aircraft fire erupting from the Caldera Rim was so thick that Allied pilots described the sky as turning black with flak bursts. In those early weeks, the skies over New Britain were a meat grinder for American bomber crews. But as the autumn of 1943 dragged on, the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare began to assert themselves. The Americans introduced the P-38 Lightning into the theater, a heavy twin-engine fighter with the range to escort the bombers all the way to Rabaul and the firepower to tear through the lightly armored Zeros. The sheer volume of Allied metal pouring into the airspace became overwhelming. The turning point arrived in early November, when Admiral Halsey borrowed the aircraft carriers USS Saratoga and USS Princeton and launched a daring, massive strike directly into Simpson Harbor to protect his vulnerable troop landings on Bougainville. The carrier planes caught the Japanese by surprise, crippling heavy cruisers and slaughtering defending fighters. Inside Rabaul, the atmosphere began to shift from confidence to deep, creeping alarm. The airfields were under near constant bombardment, leaving mechanics scrambling to salvage parts from burning wrecks to keep a dwindling number of fighters operational. Japan's industrial base could not replace the lost aircraft fast enough, and more importantly, they could not replace the veteran pilots who were dying in the skies over the volcanoes. By early 1944, the once impenetrable aerial shield was bleeding out. The daily Allied raids were no longer being met by swarms of 50 or 60 Zeros. They were met by a handful of exhausted pilots flying patched-together machines. The fortress had lost its eyes and its reach. Once the sky was contested, the Allied forces turned their attention to the water, initiating the second phase of strangulation. Rabaul was, fundamentally, an island metropolis, a mechanized war machine, and a garrison approaching 100,000 men consumed thousands of tons of supplies every single week. They required endless shipments of rice, medical supplies, aviation fuel, torpedoes, and heavy artillery shells. All of this had to be delivered across the open ocean by a fleet of vulnerable merchant vessels, known as maris, sailing down from the major fleet anchorage at Truk Atoll or the home islands of Japan. The Allies weaponized the Bismarck Sea and the St. George's Channel, turning the surrounding waters into a sprawling graveyard for Japanese logistics. American submarines, such as the Gato-class boats, prowled the deep-water trenches, tracking the convoy routes through periscope crosshairs and sending torpedoes into the hulls of heavily laden freighters. At night, PBY Catalina flying boats, painted pitch black and known as Black Cats, hunted the supply lines using early radar, dropping flares and bombs on ships trying to slip into the harbor under the cover of darkness. During the day, Kenny's bombers employed a terrifying new tactic: skip bombing. B-25s would approach a Japanese transport ship at an altitude of just 50 feet, screaming across the wavetops to evade anti-aircraft fire. At the last possible second, they would release delayed fuse bombs that literally skipped across the surface of the ocean like heavy stones, slamming directly into the broadside of the enemy hull before detonating. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese merchant marine. Convoys were utterly decimated before they even sighted the volcanic peaks of New Britain. For the men stationed on the ridges of Rabaul, the visual evidence of their isolation became impossible to ignore. In 1942, Simpson Harbor had been a bustling forest of steel masts. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and dozens of massive cargo ships had crowded the deep water basin, a terrifying projection of imperial might. But as 1943 bled into 1944, the men looked down from their artillery emplacements and watched the harbor slowly empty out. The few ships that did manage to run the gauntlet limped in trailing smoke, their decks twisted by strafing fire. The rusted, half-sunken wrecks of bombed transports began to litter the shoreline of the caldera. Then came the final, devastating blow to the garrison's lifeline. Recognizing that sending ships into the Bismarck Sea was essentially suicide, the Japanese High Command in Tokyo made a cold, pragmatic calculus. Rabaul was simply too dangerous to supply. The Navy ordered the evacuation of all remaining warships and heavy aviation assets to Truk. The logistical umbilical cord was formally severed. The harbor went completely still. The profound, suffocating anxiety of total isolation settled over the garrison. They were entirely cut off from the empire, trapped on a hostile island, surrounded by an ocean they no longer controlled. While Rabaul choked, the broader map of the Pacific War was violently shifting, bringing the third and most decisive phase of Operation Cartwheel into focus. General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey were executing their leapfrogging strategy with relentless speed. MacArthur's forces secured the northern coast of New Guinea, capturing Lae and Salamaua, and pushing across the Vitiaz Strait. Halsey's Marines and infantry secured the New Georgia Group and landed at Cape Torokina on Bougainville. In every instance, the Allies adhered to their radical doctrine. They did not attempt to conquer the entire island or wipe out every Japanese defender. They simply seized a flat piece of coastal terrain, bulldozed a perimeter, brought in the Navy Seabees, and laid down heavy bomber strips. In December 1943, the strategy reached its zenith when the 1st Marine Division landed at Cape Gloucester. Crucially, Cape Gloucester was on the island of New Britain itself, the same landmass as Rabaul, but it was located on the extreme western tip, separated from the Japanese fortress by hundreds of miles of impassable, disease-ridden jungle mountains. The Marines had no intention of marching on Rabaul. They merely captured the vital western airfields to secure the shipping lanes through the straits, effectively slamming the back door shut on the Japanese garrison. The geography of the war was moving, leaving the fortress in its wake. Throughout 1942, Rabaul had been the absolute bleeding edge of the front line, the tip of the Japanese spear pointing at Australia. But as the Allies established bases at Bougainville, Cape Gloucester, and the Admiralty Islands, the front line leaped forward. By the spring of 1944, the spearhead of the Allied offensive was hundreds of miles to the northwest, aiming at the Marianas, the Philippines, and eventually the Japanese home islands. Rabaul was no longer a forward operating base. It had been swallowed entirely by Allied-controlled territory. It was a hostile bubble trapped deep behind enemy lines. Inside the massive subterranean city of the Gazelle Peninsula, General Hitoshi Imamura commander of the 8th Area Army, and his 100,000 men continued to prepare for the end. Driven by the warrior ethos of the Imperial Japanese Army, they refused to accept that they were out of the fight. They dragged naval guns up the sheer cliffs by hand, zeroing them on the landing beaches. They laid thousands of mines in the surf. They excavated over 300 miles of tunnels into the pumice stone, creating underground hospitals, command centers, and barracks impervious to the heaviest Allied bunker-busting bombs. They possessed enough small arms ammunition, artillery shells, and discipline to inflict catastrophic casualties on any force foolish enough to step foot on the beaches. They were ready for the greatest, bloodiest amphibious defense in military history. But as the months passed, the skies above them emptied of targets. The ocean beyond the caldera remained devoid of American invasion fleets. The radio operators, sitting deep inside the volcanic rock, monitored the encrypted traffic of the Pacific War. They tracked the massive naval clashes at the Philippine Sea, the brutal island fighting at Saipan and Guam, the distant thunder of a war that was rapidly approaching the shores of Japan itself. The realization that washed over the garrison was worse than the fear of battle. It was a dawning psychological horror. The Americans knew exactly where they were. The Americans knew exactly how heavily armed they were, and the Americans simply did not care. The Allies had looked at the mightiest fortress in the South Pacific, evaluated its miles of trenches, its hundreds of artillery pieces, and its 100,000 fanatically dedicated soldiers, and decided that the most effective way to destroy it was to completely ignore it. The garrison was fully armed, fiercely fortified, and utterly powerless. The relentless, mechanical dismantling of Rabaul's strategic value was complete, setting the stage for a bizarre new reality where an entire army was imprisoned by nothing but the jungle, the sea, and its own irrelevance. Deep inside the volcanic rock of the Gazelle Peninsula, 100,000 heavily armed men woke up every morning, checked their weapons, and waited to die for the emperor. For General Hitoshi Imamura and his 8th Area Army, the silence of the ocean was not a sign of relief. It was a terrifying psychological vacuum. The rigid doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army simply did not have a manual for being ignored. Believing that a massive American amphibious fleet was still lurking just over the horizon, the garrison channeled its mounting anxiety into relentless physical labor. If the Americans were delaying the assault, the defenders would use that time to make the fortress even deadlier. They continued to expand their underground empire, carving out new command posts and dragging heavy artillery pieces into concealed caves facing the beaches. They oiled the bolts of their Arisaka rifles, fused their artillery shells, and maintained a state of absolute combat readiness. They were a fully functional, highly disciplined military machine, primed to unleash apocalyptic violence. But as 1944 stretched on, a new, far more immediate enemy emerged: basic biology. 100,000 men require a staggering amount of calories just to survive, and the last Japanese supply ship had vanished months ago. The stockpiled military rations were disappearing. To prevent his formidable garrison from starving to death in their own trenches, General Imamura ordered a bizarre, surreal transformation. The conquerors of the South Pacific were forced to become a self-sustaining agricultural colony. Soldiers who had fought their way through China, Malaya, and the suffocating jungles of New Guinea now laid down their rifles and picked up hoes. They cleared vast tracts of jungle across the peninsula, transforming the volcanic slopes into massive, meticulously organized vegetable gardens. They planted thousands of acres of sweet potatoes, cassava, eggplant, and tapioca. They engineered complex irrigation systems to capture the monsoon rains. Naval infantrymen wove nets to trap fish in the caldera, while combat engineers extracted salt from seawater and distilled primitive medicines from local jungle bark. It was a staggering logistical achievement. They did not starve. They kept the hospitals running deep inside the pumice stone tunnels. They maintained their command structure, their uniforms, and their unwavering discipline. From the outside, Rabaul remained a lethal, heavily defended stronghold. Yet, the psychological toll of this existence was devastating. The samurai ethos of the Japanese military demanded a glorious death in combat, a final, bloody stand to bleed the enemy and protect the home islands. Instead, veteran shock troops found themselves spending their days weeding sweet potato patches and repairing leaky roofs. They were trapped in a surreal, static purgatory. They lived like moles, rarely venturing out into the open to avoid the occasional Allied reconnaissance plane, conducting their farming and fishing mostly under the cover of darkness. They were a ghost army, haunting their own fortress, meticulously maintaining weapons that had absolutely nothing to shoot at. The sheer impotence of their situation was agonizing. They possessed the firepower to annihilate an invasion fleet, but they could not project that power a single mile beyond their own shores. They had been effectively neutralized, without a single American infantryman stepping foot on the beaches. But the Allies were not entirely finished with Rabaul. General MacArthur and Admiral Halsey had successfully isolated the mighty fortress, rendering its defenders completely useless to the Japanese Empire. Yet, as the front lines moved thousands of miles away, the Allied command realized that this massive, trapped garrison could still serve one final, profoundly humiliating purpose. By the latter half of 1944, the sprawling complex of Simpson Harbor was no longer a strategic target. The United States military had effectively crossed it off the map of active threats, but they did not stop flying over the Gazelle Peninsula. Instead, the Allied command repurposed the mighty fortress, converting the absolute linchpin of the Japanese Empire into a live-fire training range for rookie aviators. As fresh American bomber and fighter squadrons deployed to the Pacific Theater, young pilots straight out of flight schools in Texas and Florida needed real-world combat experience before being sent to the grueling front lines over the Philippines or Okinawa. Rabaul offered the perfect contained environment. Marine Corsair squadrons and Navy Avenger crews stationed on nearby Bougainville or the Green Islands began flying what they casually referred to as milk runs over the caldera. They would practice their dive-bombing techniques, test new ordnance, and run strafing drills against the scattered, heavily camouflaged Japanese positions. If a young lieutenant needed to learn how to navigate through active anti-aircraft fire without the risk of facing veteran enemy fighter interceptors, he was sent to Rabaul. For the 100,000 Japanese troops digging into the volcanic ash below, the realization of what was happening brought a new, agonizing dimension to their isolation. They were not being besieged, they were being used. General Imamura's men were manning sophisticated Type 99 88mm anti-aircraft guns and heavy coastal batteries. They possessed mountains of artillery shells, carefully stacked in miles of subterranean magazines. When the air raid sirens wailed, they would rush to their firing pits, track the incoming American aircraft, and fill the tropical sky with black flak bursts. They fought back with intense, disciplined ferocity. But as the months bled into 1945, the psychological reality of these engagements set in. The Americans were not trying to soften the beaches for an invasion. They were not trying to obliterate the command structure. They were simply dropping practice bombs and logging flight hours before flying off to fight the actual war somewhere else. The sheer absurdity of the garrison's existence reached its absolute peak. Here was an army nearly the size of the entire Allied invasion force that landed at Normandy on D-Day. They had excavated hundreds of miles of underground fortresses, complete with fully equipped subterranean hospitals, electric lighting, and sprawling command centers safe beneath the pumice stone. They maintained thousands of machine guns, meticulously oiled Arisaka rifles, and millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. They had fortified every conceivable landing zone with interlocking fields of fire, anti-tank ditches, and submerged naval mines. They were arguably the most heavily entrenched, well-supplied, and disciplined defensive force on the face of the planet, and they had absolutely nothing to do. Their coastal artillery was zeroed in on empty beaches. Their heavy machine guns pointed at quiet waves. Their massive stockpiles of ammunition were utterly useless because there was no enemy infantry to shoot at. and no transport ships to carry them to where the enemy actually was. The United States Navy did not even need to waste resources establishing a physical blockade around the island. The immense, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean and the sheer distance to any friendly port acted as the ultimate prison walls. The Imperial Japanese Army had built a magnificent fortress, only to find themselves locked inside it as the warden threw away the key. Rabaul had become an inescapable, open-air prisoner-of-war camp, guarded entirely by geography. As the spring and summer of 1945 approached, the psychological pressure inside the caldera became suffocating. Deep inside their volcanic tunnels, the radio operators of the 8th Area Army listened helplessly to the encrypted broadcasts detailing the systematic destruction of their empire. They heard the frantic, desperate transmissions from the Mariana Islands, the horrifying casualty reports from Iwo Jima, and the apocalyptic naval clashes off the coast of Okinawa. They listened as B-29 superfortresses burned the wooden cities of the Japanese home islands to the ground. General Imamura and his 100,000 men were trapped in a state of agonizing impotence. The warrior code they followed demanded that they shed their blood in defense of their homeland, to inflict such catastrophic losses on the Americans that Tokyo might negotiate a favorable peace. They were desperate for the United States Marines to finally storm the beaches of Simpson Harbor, so they could unleash the apocalyptic violence they had spent years preparing. They wanted the final, glorious stand. They waited in the sweltering heat, their weapons primed, staring out at the empty horizon of the Bismarck Sea, begging for a battle that the architects of the Allied victory had already decided would never happen. That battle never arrived. On August 15, 1945, the agonizing wait was abruptly shattered not by the thunder of naval gunfire, but by the crackling static of a radio broadcast. Deep inside the pumice stone bunkers of the Gazelle Peninsula, General Hitoshi Imamura and his command staff stood in stunned silence as they listened to the recorded voice of Emperor Hirohito announcing the unconditional capitulation of the Japanese Empire. The most devastating conflict in human history was over. Tokyo had surrendered. The Imperial Japanese Navy was resting at the bottom of the ocean, yet Rabaul was still standing exactly where the Allies had left it. When the formal surrender of the regional forces took place a few weeks later, Allied commanders finally sailed into the once terrifying anchorage of Simpson Harbor. What they found waiting for them on the volcanic shores was one of the most surreal spectacles of the entire Pacific theater. The inspecting officers did not find a shattered, decimated skeleton crew clinging to the ruins of a conquered base. Instead, they stepped ashore to find nearly 100,000 Imperial Japanese troops standing in rigid, flawless formation. The soldiers were relatively healthy, well-fed from their sprawling subterranean farms, and perfectly disciplined. The Americans and Australians were led through an underground metropolis that staggered the military imagination. They walked past hundreds of miles of reinforced tunnels, fully functioning hospitals, and immense magazines stacked to the ceiling with untouched ammunition. They inspected heavy coastal batteries that had been immaculately oiled and maintained for years, guns that had never fired a single armor-piercing round at an invading landing craft. General Imamura handed over an absolute juggernaut of a military force, an army capable of unleashing unimaginable slaughter, entirely intact and completely defeated. The bloodless capitulation of Rabaul validated the profound gamble of Operation Cartwheel and permanently altered the trajectory of modern military strategy. MacArthur and Halsey had proven a radical new truth. The sheer physical strength of an enemy stronghold is completely irrelevant if that stronghold cannot project its power. In modern mechanized warfare, an army without a logistical umbilical cord is not a threat. It is a stranded asset. The Allies took Japan's most terrifying geographic advantage, a massive, impenetrable fortress anchored in the South Pacific, and weaponized its own immense weight against it. By systematically severing the sea lanes and dominating the surrounding airspace, they bypassed the heavy guns and completely bypassed the anticipated slaughter. They essentially forced the Japanese government to foot the bill for feeding, housing, and isolating 100,000 of its own elite soldiers in a self-sustaining, open-air prisoner-of-war camp. The impregnable fortress of Rabaul was never breached, its beaches were never stormed, and its fanatical defenders were never conquered in the field. But they were destroyed all the same. The greatest siege of the Pacific War ended in absolute silence, leaving behind a profound realization about the true nature of victory. For centuries, the brutal mathematics of warfare dictated that to defeat a fortified enemy, you had to bleed for every inch of ground. Rabaul shattered that ancient equation. Today, the sprawling caldera of Simpson Harbor hides the overgrown remains of massive coastal guns that never fired in anger, guarding miles of empty tunnels built for an apocalyptic battle that existed only in the minds of the men waiting for it. The 100,000 Imperial troops who finally laid down their weapons in the jungle did not lose because they lacked discipline, firepower, or the fanatical will to fight to the last man. They were simply rendered obsolete by a map that kept moving forward without them. Their bloodless defeat proved a cold, enduring truth about the reality of modern combat. Sometimes, the most devastating way to destroy an impenetrable fortress isn't to sacrifice thousands of lives trying to breach its walls. It is simply to make sure the war passes it by.